Hello, everyone. My name is Bernie Canapes. I'm chair of the philosophy department, chair of the philosophy department here in Meridian College. I just want to start before we start. Welcome, everyone. And every year we give out 2 awards to graduating seniors here at Meridian College. And we want to do this award ceremony first to begin. Later I'll introduce our dean and then the speaker. Okay, so the first award that we're giving out is the Frederick Jiggs McConnell Prize. Dr. McConnell was a professor here for 25 years, and he left in the 80s, early 80s. Influenced a lot of people, and so we have this prize that is awarded every year. It is awarded to a graduating senior when the judgment of the Department of Philosophy has demonstrated excellence in moral philosophy. And this year, the winner, and it comes with a cash prize, is Hannah Matthews. Hannah couldn't be here today. She's at another conference, but so.
The honor of philosopher.
And then we have the second award is the Douglas Anderson Prize. Douglas Anderson is an alum from Moravian College, graduated in '82. He's now at University of North Texas. He's a philosopher, and he's become a very prominent philosopher, reading several books. And he's been back to our conference, and he's doing one of the plenary talks when we first started the conference. The Douglas Anderson Prize is a $200 prize awarded to a graduating philosophy major when the judgment of the Department of Philosophy has demonstrated outstanding achievement in the study of philosophy and outstanding service and leadership within the Department of Philosophy. And this year we have 2 winners. Nicholas Gaspar, and he's here. And we also have Colton Carlisle. Good having you in class always. I also just want to mention that Armando and Joel are here. What guys, stand up. They started this conference 9 years ago, and they come every year.
Can't get rid of us.
So thank you. I want to introduce now our dean, Dr. Mihan.
Thank you to the 2 of you for getting this conference going. This is the kind of event I love attending and taking part in as I can. I joined the college just last year, and what a college to join. The 6th oldest, being Delaware by 1 year, I found out today. So the 6th oldest college in the country, and as our president, Brian Grigsby, is fond of reminding us, we were started by a young girl who reached out and thought it would be appropriate to educate the natives and the young girls in the area. And Moravian College has always focused on education as its central mission. Education in its various forms, and I think a conference is one of those forms where we educate ourselves and each other. Brian, I know, wanted to be here, and our provost, Cynthia Casso, wanted to be here as well. I think we're fortunate in having Brian as a medievist, so we can be looking backward and forward at the same time. And Cynthia is a historian, so we got that aspect of it covered as well. Now, what we're doing here today, wrestling with some really important issues of thought and belief. For me, I kind of first came across the idea of Pascal's wager as an adolescent in a short little novella by James Blish called A Case of Conscience. And at that time, I didn't know it, but it was part of this really sub-genre of sci-fi that I started calling Jesuits in Space. Which is a great it's Mary Dariah Russell has a book called The Sparrow, and she wrote a sequel to it. It's not coming in at the moment, but back to Jesuits in Space. But the wager at that point made some impression on me. But the whole idea of belief and calculation really got me thinking a little bit about how do you wrestle with those things. Well, kind of put it aside for quite some time, and then I came across the Venerable Bede as an undergrad, talking about the uncertainty of life and how you liken this life to that sparrow flying through the hall, and you get that momentary bit of lightness in the middle of all the darkness that surrounds us. A moment of certainty in the midst of all that uncertainty around you. I think most of the time we're looking to create certainties or find certainties in various forms of various durations. Given what I've read of Jeffrey Jordan, I'm certain we're in for a very illuminating talk. Jeffrey's the author of at least 6 books, numerous articles. I want to make sure I get the title right of the books, Jeffrey. Pascal's Wager, Pragmatic Arguments and Belief in God. Philosophy, that was in 2006. Philosophy of Religion, The Key Thinkers, which had a Portuguese translation just a couple of years ago. Philosophies of Life, a supplement. Faith, Freedom, and Rationality, Essays in the Philosophy of Religion. And was this your first one, Gambling on God? Yeah, Gambling on God, Essays on Pascal's Wager. I'm looking forward to really learning how to better wrestle with the kinds of questions that Pascal's Wager poses for us. And I'll be profane and do a bit of a parody of Pascal's Pensée, 250. So we'll sit and we'll clap and we'll get some certainty for Jeffrey Jordan.
It's not fair to expect me to follow that. I don't expect an administrator to be so eloquent. I appreciate your comments. I do have to, several of the books are edited volumes. So the Pascal's Wager, that's a monograph, the others are edited volumes. So they're not all monographs. Thank you for the invitation to be here, and thank you for the invitation to talk about Pascal. So as Dean said, Pascal's Wager is a wonderful topic. Pascal, just to historically situate, we're not going to do history. One reason I'm not a historian. But Pascal, 17th century thinker, born in 1623, died in 1662. So he dies young, dies at 39, but he's a child prodigy, a scientific genius, a mathematician. You've heard of Pascal's triangle. He does seminal work on atmospherics, pressures. Indeed, Pascal that phrase is used in science of fluids. It's a unit of measure, the Pascal. And in computer science, Pascal is a program. So there's the historical person, Pascal. We'll be talking about Pascal's Wager. He's had this tremendous influence. So very much a polymath. Pascal's Wager was groundbreaking. So it has to do with the question, does God exist? And of course, when you approach the question, does God exist, usually you do it by way of what we'll call epistemic or evidential reasons, argument. think of an argument like this. Every being that exists either is caused by itself or caused by another. Those beings caused by themselves, call those self-caused beings. Caused by another, dependent beings. And no being is caused by nothing. But not every being can be caused by another, because suppose, let's take an analogy. Every human is caused by another human, or caused by two preceding humans, right? So every person has been born from two other people. So every person, you can go back in the chain of persons, and you always find the cause. But that fact that every person is dependent on some prior persons, that doesn't answer the question, why are there persons? Why are there humans? It may answer the question, why is there this particular human? Well, she's got these parents. But why are there humans? So if you say, every being's a dependent being, well, we've got something left unexplained. Why are there persons? And so this is Clarke's cosmological argument. And of course, it's very controversial. People say, well, wait a second, why can't you have something caused by nothing? Why can't things just pop into existence, as it were? Or things just have always been? How do we know every being is either dependent or self-caused? Of course, Clarke argues there has to be a self-caused being. That self-caused being has to have the other attributes that theists say God has. That's the cosmology. And the scholastics, the Middle Age, they were, Thomas Aquinas had 5 ways of proving the existence of God. And lots of debate over arguments like that. Pascal comes at a time when these arguments have lost some force. Now, it's a different question whether they should have lost force or not, but they have, Pascal's time. I actually kind of like some of these arguments. I think a proper version of the ontological argument, I think it's a sound argument. But I think I'm probably the only one who thinks that. But there you go. But Pascal comes along, and he's dealing with what we can call the libertines, folks who think science is the wave of the future, that the old theologies are obsolete, and they're interested in games of chance. And there's no probability theory at this time. Pascal is instrumental in developing probability theory in correspondence with other thinkers and mathematicians dealing with problems in throwing dice, dealing cards, and things like that. Pascal has a religious experience, and it profoundly changes his life, and so he becomes very interested in theology. He's French, he's Catholic. His religious experience converts him to a form of Catholicism called Jansenism, which is not a theologian, I'm not a religious scholar or historian, but basically it's a version of Catholicism that's Calvinism, as far as I could tell. It's a Catholic form of Calvinism. And he decides to write an apology, a defense of Christian belief, the point says. But he never finishes it. He starts at around 1660, dies in 1662. So what's left are these collection of notes. And in that collection of notes, there's a passage about the wager. And what's going on there is what we call the pragmatic turn. Pascal is moving away from evidential reasons, epistemic reasons, reasons to persuade you that a proposition is true. Clarke's cosmological argument is trying to persuade you, look, here are reasons for accepting the conclusion that there's a self-caused being. And that self-caused being has the other attributes associated with the theistic notion of God. Pascal's moving away from that. Pascal is interested in pragmatic reasons. So evidential epistemic reasons are reasons that have to do with the truth or or the likelihood or the probability of a proposition. Pragmatic reasons are reasons that have to do with the utility, the value, the advantage, the benefit of believing a proposition. It's one thing, so think of that phrase, believing a proposition. There's the act of believing, and there's the thing, believe, the proposition. There's believing the proposition, and there's a proposition. Epistemic arguments, evidential arguments, reasons, they're trying to give you evidence for why this proposition should be believed. Pascal is going to try to give you a reason for why believing this proposition is advisable. That's the pragmatic term. So Pascal develops, in these fragmentary notes, 4 versions of the wager. And in doing so, he invents a foundational principle still used by economists today and other folks involved in decision theory called maximizing expected utility. He invents that as he develops the 4 versions. So you should have a handout in front of you, and that's not a full outline of what I'll be talking about, but we'll come to that outline, that handout. That's basically what I have there, that matrix. That's going to be, I think, the 4th version. But let me describe the 3 prior versions to you before we talk about that one. And I should say, if there's something strikes you as unclear or disputable or objectionable, just feel free to raise your hand and ask. We don't have to wait till the end. I find if you're not sure about something and you wait till the end, it's like, well, from that point where you're not sure till the end, it's like stuff gets cluttered, right? So if something's unclear, feel free to ask. So Pascal develops his 4 versions. His first version goes like this. And it's what we call today a decision under uncertainty. Decisions under uncertainty in decision theory are where we have no idea of the probabilities associated with the propositions and the outcomes. But we have some idea of the value of the outcomes. So on that handout, you see that matrix, that box, about a third of the way down. So you see we have alternatives, we have states, we have outcomes. So alternatives are things you decide between, A or B. Should I take an umbrella? Should I not take an umbrella? That would be an example of alternative. States are the way the world could turn out. It's raining. It's not raining. Now, I've got a 2x2 matrix here. You can have more than 2 alternatives. You can have more than 2 states. You could have 3 alternatives, 2 states. You could have 10 alternatives, 4 states. But this is a 2x2. With 2 alternatives, 2 states, you're going to get 4 outcomes. So the outcomes are what's the value or the utility of these given alternatives on how the world turns out, which state obtains. And so the first version Pascal develops no probabilities associated. And Pascal says, very roughly paraphrasing, think about it. If you believe that God exists, and God exists, you gain eternity. Eternity, heaven. Heaven is this place of supreme happiness in which each moment of existence is saturated fully to happiness, and, he doesn't use this phrase, there's no diminishing marginal utility. There's no too much of a good thing. It's not like it gets so, it's good this far, and then all of a sudden the value starts to drop off. Each moment is as saturated in happiness as each preceding moment, so there's no diminishing marginal utility. That's really good. If you believe that God exists, it turns out God doesn't exist, you've lost something. You believe something was false. You cluttered up your Sunday mornings, or your Saturday mornings, or your Friday mornings. You've lost some time. You've had a false belief, but it's a finite loss. If you don't believe and God exists, you've lost big. Now Pascal doesn't have hell. A lot of versions of the wager you'll see hell. And Pascal in his 4 versions doesn't include hell in there. Now, the Port Royal community, the folks that Pascal lived with, they later, after Pascal's death, they developed what's known as the Port Royal logic. And this was an important book in the development of logic. And in there, they developed a version of the wager, and they stuck hell in that. But that was post-Pascal. But Pascal says, look, if you don't believe in God exists, you have lost big. You lost a chance at eternity. And you don't believe God doesn't exist? Yeah, it's, you didn't waste your Sunday mornings or your Saturday mornings or your Friday mornings, as the case may be. The rational person. So Pascal, along with modern day economists, modern day decision theorists, perhaps common sense, maybe not common sense, but Pascal says, look, the rational person is an optimizer, a maximizer. If you've got 2 alternatives, A and B, you judge A is better than B. Rationality would dictate you select A. Pascal says, look, belief is associated with the best outcome, and we don't know the probabilities. Rationality dictates you believe. Of course, it might occur to you, well, how can I just believe?
Go ahead. So, is the action of coming to believe a proposition just the same sort of action as choosing an umbrella or not?
Yeah. So good question. So with evidential reasons, you're looking at reasons which support a proposition. With pragmatics, you're thinking about actions. What's the advisable action to take? What's the advisable decision to take? And so Pascal is not what's sometimes called a dosastic voluntarist. Dosastic voluntarism is a really badly named idea, perhaps, but it's the idea that you can believe at will. You can directly believe or disbelieve a proposition. You can just cause yourself to believe something. I would like to believe the Cubs won the series this year as well as last year. And in fact, dosastic voluntarism is false. You just can't. I mean, there are steps you can take to cause yourself to believe something. I can easily, simply cause you to believe that I have a bottle of water. Look, see. Now all of you have that belief. But that's not direct by will. And so dosastic voluntarism says you can just cause. Pascal's not a dosastic voluntarist. And so when I say believe, I have on my sheet believe, don't believe. Really, it should be culcate belief, or inculcate belief, or habituate belief. Take steps to believe. Accept. Presumably we can accept propositions at will, even if we can't believe. And we can cause ourselves, bring ourselves to belief by accepting a proposition. And so Pascal, so forming a belief, inculcating a belief, that would be like the decision whether or not to take an umbrella.
And what would this process of inculcation look like?
In the Pensées, where Pascal says he gives advice, so go take the holy waters, he assumes that faith is this may sound bad, he assumes that faith is a contagion. It's contagious. Associate with the faithful, you'll catch it. It's catching. I should have said it's catching instead of contagion is bad. Faith is catching. You associate with the faithful and you'll catch it. Imitate it's very Aristotelian. You want to be virtuous? How do you be virtuous? Find virtuous people and imitate them. You'll become virtuous. It's that sort of thing. Yeah. Questions? So Pascal, yeah.
So my question is that in your matrix, like in the box, that you have that if you believe and God doesn't exist, it's a 2 or a 3. So essentially, were you on the verge of like deciding?
Well, it's so the 4th version that I'll spend the most time with, Pascal actually assumes believing that God exists is even better when God doesn't exist than not believing. And he actually says, it almost sounds like the Boy Scout code of honor. He says, what harm will you come to? You'll be trustworthy, brave, loyal. You actually get some, you'll turn out to be like this. And he says, sure, you won't, he actually has a phrase, sure, you won't enjoy the worldly pleasures, but you'll enjoy others. I think by that he didn't mean other worldly pleasures. But so Pascal historically puts a 2 there. Arguably, someone might say no, 3, but it won't make a difference.
Okay. Just on the fence a little bit.
Well, me personally, or Pascal?
I mean, I agree with like my statement, just because, I don't know, you're right, like you live a good life of morality, but then like from my standpoint, it would be like, I feel like I'm getting let down, so you could go either way.
Yeah, the interesting thing though, if you believe God exists and it turns out God doesn't exist, you're probably not going to know it.
You're right.
Whereas if you believe God doesn't exist and it turns out he does, you might,
Yeah.
you might there have some disappointment.
Okay.
That's possible. Yeah. So the parentheticals, in fact, so Pascal actually would put a 2 there. I was saying, well, it might better be a 3.
Yeah.
It won't matter. It won't matter. Yeah, good questions. Other questions? So Pascal's first version is a decision under uncertainty, no probabilities associated with the states. So we don't know what the probabilities are that God exists, God doesn't exist, no probabilities associated with the states. We're basing it strictly on what we today would call decision theoretic principles. And so in the first version, Pascal says, look, pick an alternative associated with the best outcome, pick an, in effect, he could even, if you do put a 2 there, pick an alternative, this is Rawls in the theory of justice, pick an alternative whose worst state is as good as or better than the worst states of all other alternatives. I mean, that's John Rawls' theory of justice behind the veil. So his first version is a dominance version of the wager. Decision under certainty, but it's dominance. Believing that God exists dominates not believing. Okay, so it's a dominance version. Believing is associated with the best possible outcome. Okay. His second version. Now here's where Pascal becomes innovative. He introduces probabilities. And this is a major step in the development of probability calculus, the development of thought about probabilities. He says, assume it's 50-50. So we got our states, God exists or God doesn't exist. 50% likely God exists, 50% likely God doesn't. Assume it's 50-50. And now he's going to invent maximizing expected utility. If God exists, you get infinity. What does that mean? Well, it's not easy to see, but it looks like we've got an eternity of discrete moments, each supremely happy. So it looked like we could maybe call that infinity. It's a mathematical terms, it's a non-convergent series. Yeah, okay, we'll call that infinity. Infinity discounted by some finite amount, infinity times 1/2, half of infinity. If you think of the integers, the positive integers, subtract out the odd numbers, you still got infinity. So 50-50. If God exists, you get infinity. When you calculate maximizing expected, you calculate it by the value of the outcome times multiplied by the probability or discounted by the probability minus any cost. It's going to be finite. And with infinite values, right? Infinite value times any finite amount, any non-zero finite amount, any non-zero non-infinitesimal finite amount gives you infinity. Pascal says, look, again, you should believe. There's a maximizing expected utility. Expected utility of belief is far, far greater. It's infinite than that associated with not belief. It's always going to be finite. You should believe. Well, let's go to the third version. Because you might say, well, wait, 50-50? That's not likely. So here, Pascal in the third version invents the version of the wager, which is sort of the canonical version of the wager. This is the version of the wager philosophers always like to talk about. It's almost scandalous for a philosopher. It's intellectually titillating for philosophers. You don't say, this can't be right. Pascal says, look, if you don't want to say it's 50-50, assign some positive probability, no matter how small. It can't be infinitesimal, but no matter how small, some positive probability. 1 out of 1,000, 1 out of 1,000,000, 1 out of 1,000,000,000 times infinity is infinity. Any finite, non-zero, non-infinitesimal amount times infinity is infinity. So in the third version, Pascal says, look, as long as you agree there's some probability that God exists, you should believe. You've got an infinite expected utility there. Now, of course, you can see why this is the version philosophers always want to talk about, right? It's, oh, holy cow, the evidence all points one way, and yet rationality seems, man, we go this other way. Now, Pascal, by the way, Pascal is very probably not a fideist. A fideist is someone who comes along and says, look, what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? There should be no arguments attached to religious belief. Pascal's not that. Pascal's not saying, look, because it's absurd, it's a reason to believe. He's not saying that. He does say one place, the heart has its reasons, the head knows nothing of. So that sounds fideistic. But I mean, Pascal didn't believe that it's really, really, really unlikely God exists. He's just methodologically almost, I think, saying, look, even if you're a hardcore atheist, you ought to believe, unless you think you've got an argument that the existence of God is absolutely impossible. Logical problem of evil. I mean, people today don't much talk about the logical problem of evil. They think it was probably solved. And by the way, when people say there's never progress in philosophy, oh yeah, people don't talk about the logical problem of evil today. Not much. There are some folks who try to resurrect it. Not much. It was, the stake was driven to its heart in the 70s by free will defense. Al Plantinga's free will defense. That's a kind of progress. You might say, well, that's not quite as impressive as say what was on a computer science, but hey, we'll take our progress where we can get it.
Could you quickly summarize the logical problem of evil and this?
Yeah, so the logical problem of evil, it's a version of it's the problem of evil that was around for centuries. So in Hume's dialogues, Philo says, as Epicurus once said, the proposition God exists, evil occurs, there's a contradiction. That's a contradiction. So obviously evil occurs. So we've got two propositions that entail a contradiction. We know this one's true, then this one has to be false. And Hume also, so that's dialogue 10 or 11. Hume also, in I think dialogue 11, develops what's now known as the evidential problem of evil. The evidential problem of evil says, well, evil strong evidence against the existence of God. And those are two different claims. So the logical problem of evil was done for centuries, and in the 1960s, 1970s, what was known as the free will defense was developed. The free will defense is just doing what mathematicians do to show that propositions are compatible. To show that two propositions are compatible, all you have to do is develop a model. And your model, that sounds elaborate, it just means you come up with some other propositions to tell a story. The story you tell just has to be made up of possible propositions. They don't have to be true, they don't have to be necessarily true. They can even be false, they just can't be necessarily false. So you come up with a possible story that added to one of the original pair entails the other of the original pair. So if you know, so the free will defense is you come up with this story that added to the proposition God exists entails there's evil. Now to show two propositions are contradictory, on the other hand, you've got to come up with a third proposition that added to the original pair gives you an explicit contradiction, and that third proposition has to be necessarily true. You have to know it's a necessary truth, otherwise you can get false positives. So if it's contingently true, or you have to come up with a necessary truth. No one's ever been able to do that, as far as I know. No one's ever been able to do that. And Plantinga looks like he's come up with a free will defense that most people agree, yeah, it's killed the market. There are people who still come up, who still say, well, the free will defense has this flaw or something, But most work today is done with the evidential problem of evil. Yeah. So our third version of the wager says, as long as you give it any positive probability, you've got an infinite expected utility. You should believe. And then for some reason, Pascal then goes to a fourth version. And this fourth version, so if you think about it, he starts off with the dominant version, decision under uncertainty. He then he introduces probabilities. When you introduce probabilities, those are what are called decisions under risk. So in decision theory, there's decisions under uncertainty, no probabilities. Decisions under risk, you have the utilities of the outcomes plus probabilities associated with the states. Usually you're doing maximizing expected utility at that point. So you're just taking the utilities times the probabilities minus any costs gives you the expected utility. So he does that with version 2 and version 3. So he goes from no probabilities, 50-50, to one chance out of whatever. Then he says, well, but think about it. What harm will come to you if you believe? So you can kind of see a dialectic there, kind of the flow of the argument, right? He's saying, look, even if you think it's false God exists, you ought to believe. Why? He seems to say, you'll be a better person. He seems to think being irreligious is tantamount, will lead to a worse life. And I guess you can think of population studies which do social science. I'm not a social scientist, but there are studies that show that religious populations generally have on certain social indices better outcomes than non-religious populations and so on. But social science, this might be my own ignorance, but they always seem to be contentious studies, and these sort of studies, what's being reported may be accurate. I'm just not sure the methodology is all that reliable. But Pascal wants to say, look, the best outcome is associated with believing that God exists. The second best outcome is believing that God exists. Even if God doesn't believe, you're going to live a better life. You'll have a life of hope. You're not going to know you embraced a false commitment, a false belief. You're going to have a better life. Rationality demands that you maximize. And so his last version, super dominance, right? He started out with dominance, now he's got super dominance. Belief is going to dominate non-belief if God exists, and belief is going to dominate non-belief even if God doesn't exist. It's super dominant. And so those are the four versions of Pascal's wager. Yeah.
So what's the motivation for Pascal to understand, the benefit or utility of belief in terms for the self? So I can see, a wager being constructed where belief and the utility of it is for the community, or, say you have a particular religion that, has, these really radical moral claims where, you kill individuals and so forth, and of course it depends on the religion you're talking about, but then I can see how utility is measured as a community. Well, we shouldn't believe in this God because it's bad for the community. He deems that we should do these horrific things. So where's the motivation for Pascal at this time period to find utility in the self rather than
the whole? So for the self, I think it's easier. I actually think it's easier to see than for the community. For the self, think post-mortem, right? Pascal says, look, if you believe God exists and God exists, you gain eternity. Right? But if you don't believe that God exists, you lose that. So that's motivation. And then in that fourth version, he seems to think there are all sorts of virtues, all sorts of habits of life that contribute to human flourishing that are associated with belief that aren't typically or aren't found with disbelief or non-belief. And so that would, trustworthy, loyal, brave, clean, the Boy Scout code. Yeah. And you should look up Point Sage. He does give it, but you'll be da-da-da-da. These sorts of habits of living that contribute to human happiness, human flourishing. And so it'd be those sort of motivations. So I've always seen, the way you put it kind of surprised me, because to you, the sort of community good was more obvious than the personal good. I always thought it the other way. The individual good's more obvious than the community. But Pascal argues, and maybe he's right, that there's even community and social level goods. Yeah.
Kind of a similar question. So, in what way then does he measure like the social discrimination that religion can subject one to in terms of how it weighs out in utility towards women?
Yeah, I don't know that he certainly didn't deal with that question, and that's a question more on the collective level, social level too, right? There are costs associated with religious belief. One could argue, certainly opportunity costs. You believe this religion, you not believe that one, and so on and so on. And as with any human institution, religious institutions are going to have a positive side, and there will be a negative side as well. And so, I mean, there have been people like, you've heard of the New Atheist. So the late Christopher Hitchens, he wrote a book where the subtitle was "Religion Poisons Everything." That's probably a little extreme. I mean, you think of, say, Bach's Brandenburg Concertos, it's not clear that's poisonous, and so on. Or you go into St. Peter's, it's not clear that's poisonous. But yeah, there's certainly, history does give evidence that religious institutions can have a negative side as well. Where would that come in? I suppose that would come in as part of the cost. So in maximizing expected utility, you've got your utility times probability minus any cost, and that cost would be cost to the individual. You can include their cost to the community and so on. I mean, you can say, well, does this make sense? You could say, look, I choose to be a Cubs fan, even though I know being a Cubs fan historically has led to severe disappointment and forlorn loss. Yeah, I mean, you can imagine someone making that sort of claim, recognizing that aligning myself with this community, there is a history. You certainly wouldn't align yourself with any community that has a net balance, right, negative over positive. But it's certainly true, every institution associated with humans is going to have negative sides. And so I think that would come in on the cost. The ledger would come with the cost. Does that make sense? Yeah.
So I noticed a parallel between John Stuart Mill and Pascal, particularly with respect to the greatest happiness principle. And I was wondering if you would think that Pascal would agree with that principle, especially with respect to measuring utility.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Of course, with Mill, that's a meta-ethical way of explaining what rightness and wrongness is. And Pascal doesn't do that. Would Pascal have been some kind of consequentialist? That's a good question. I'm not sure. I'm not sure. His personality strikes me more as a non-consequentialist, a deontologist or something. And I suppose you can, with decision theory, embrace a kind of maximize expected utility without also, in ethics, being a consequentialist. I never really thought about it. I suppose that's possible. Well, I guess it better be possible, because a lot of people are doing that. I assume they're not contradictory. But I don't know what Pascal did. I'm not sure. Off the top of my head, he strikes me. If you were to push me for evidence of this, I'd be hard pressed to do it. But he strikes me as a non-consequentialist. And Mill, on liberty, he's a non-consequentialist there. Folks always try to come up with consequentialist justification for freedom of speech and so on, and you can do that. But Mill pretty clearly is a non-consequentialist. He's saying that the value of this is so great, I don't care what the consequences. Let justice prevail, even though the heavens may fall. Let justice prevail. I mean, Mill doesn't say that, but that's the sentiment on liberty. Well, what are some objections to Pascal? What are some objections? So look on your handout. So here in the middle of the handout, so here's, I think, the fourth version. If we were to represent it represent the way we do today. For any person S, if one of the alternatives available to S has an outcome better than the outcomes of the other alternatives, and never an outcome worse than the worst outcomes of the other alternatives, S should choose that alternative. So choose that alternative that's associated with the best and insulates you from the worst outcome. So there's one that matches that description. And the second premise says, well, in fact, the best outcome associated with believing that God exists is better than all the others, and the worst outcome of believing is better than that of not believing. And that's certainly, if you let Pascal get away with putting the 2 in the upper right-hand cell of the outcomes, you certainly see that. And at least, even if you put a 3 there, I didn't rephrase 2 because I want to try to do it, but the way the first premise is, that accommodates even if there's a 3 in that upper right-hand cell. The worst outcome, so the worst outcome of not believing is a 4, right? 4 is the worst. So even if you stick a 3 up there, it's still not worse than the worst outcome of not believing. So Pascal's covered on that. One should believe that God exists. Now you won't be surprised to learn, I mean it's philosophy, you won't be surprised to learn there are objections to Pascal's wager, right? It's got to happen. And the first one is what's called the many gods objection. Pascal's wager, you could use it for any number of incompatible alternatives. Pascal's a Catholic, a particular kind of Catholic, a Jansenist Catholic. We'll just think of Catholicism. They're Jesuits and Dominicans and Franciscans. Could you do a wager for all those? Well, now let's bring in the Protestants. There's the Calvinists, the Lutherans, the Moravians. Could you do a wager for those? Think of the Baptists. Last I heard, there were some 55 kinds of Baptists. Free will Baptists, General Baptists, hard shell Baptists, soft shell Baptists. I'm not making those up, there are actually hard shell and soft shell Baptists. I mean, it looks like we've got an embarrassment of riches here, an embarrassment of Pascalian riches here. And I think the first thing to realize is the wager has to be seen theistically, ecumenically. So it is certainly true that Pascal was a Catholic, and it's certainly true where he gives advice where he says, so how do you become faithful? We'll associate with faithful, and he would have identified the faithful as being, certain set. But the first thing to notice is the wager has to be understood as for theism. Now, if you think of Judaism and Christianity and Islam, those are expanded versions of theism. Theism is the proposition that God exists, whereby God we spell out. So the proposition God exists is theism. Expanded theism is you can join to the proposition God exists other beliefs, other doctrines. And so that'll give you, say with Christianity, take the Apostles' Creed, join it with the belief God exists. There you got Christianity. And then add other, So the wager is not for expanded theism. The wager is for theism. So that takes care of a lot of problems. So we've narrowed our partition. Partition is the term people use for our range of alternatives, what we're going to pick from. So the many gods objection tries to inflate the partition, inflate it with a huge population, right? Such that this is just impractical. Now we're trying to deflate it, try to narrow our partition. And so one way we do it is by saying, well, look, the wager is for theism, ecumenical theism, as it were. But that still doesn't get us down to, as Pascal has it, God or no God. Believe in God or don't believe in God. Another thing to notice is the wager is a forced choice. So the way Pascal puts it in the Points is there's a coin flipping in eternity, and you have to call heads or tails before you see it land. The uncertainty. We're in the midst of uncertainty, and yet to say it's uncertain doesn't mean you can defer the choice. You can't. Trying to defer the choice has the practical effect of having embraced one of the alternatives. The alternatives are take steps to believe, don't take steps to believe. I'm going to defer a choice. That has the practical effect of not taking steps to believe. Saying I'm not going to choose, that has the practical effect of status quo. You've chosen. You've chosen. It's a forced choice. So that's the second thing to realize. You can't evade the wager. It's a forced choice. The idea of a forced choice is most famously associated with William James, perhaps America's greatest philosopher produced by America, arguably. Harvard psychologist, until he came to his senses and moved over to the Department of Philosophy. It's a forced choice. People, by the way, that Will to Believe essay, wonderful essay, you should read it. Early, James has these sentences, it sounds like he's shocked at Pascal's wager. And people always quote that. And yet at the end of James's essay, he says, it looks like Pascal has it right. He has it right. So, everybody quotes the first part of the essay, never quotes the end of it. It drives me crazy. So, ecumenical wager, it's a forced choice. But philosophers are an ingenious bunch. They say, well, wait a second. Couldn't there be a perverse master of the universe? And the perverse master of the universe punishes theistic believers with hell and rewards atheists with eternity. Isn't that possible? And all you need is possibility. Possibility, going to give you probability, going to give you infinite expected utility. We've got you. Well, I think the Pascalian can say this. That idea that possibility generates probability, that can be answered in a couple ways. And both ways are sort of interesting. Not sort of, both ways are interesting. The first way is this. Logical possibility is not enough to give you probability. Philosophers and logicians like to talk about logical possibility, metaphysical possibility, physical possibility. So logical possibility would be anything you can describe consistently. You can give a description without encountering a contradiction. That's logically possible. Metaphysical possibility is what's possible given reality. So, in reality, water's H2O. Now, can we imagine water being something other than H2O? Sure, we can imagine that. It's logically possible. But it's not metaphysically possible. Given reality, water is essentially H2O. It couldn't be otherwise. It'd be water. Physical possibility has to do with laws of nature. But probability doesn't come from logical possibility alone. It comes from metaphysical possibility. If something's metaphysically possible, it may warrant some probability assignment, perhaps. But something can be logically possible and not warrant any probability assignment. Why? Because you wouldn't want to say something's logically possible and probable and yet metaphysically impossible. That would be a big problem. Think of concentric circles. A big circle is logical possibility, metaphysical possibility, gnomic or physical possibility. I mean, if something's metaphysically possible, it's supposed to be logically possible. You wouldn't want to say that something's metaphysically impossible and yet probable. That would be a problem. And so these philosophers who come up with these what we'll call philosophical fictions, or philosophers' fictions, the perverse master of the universe, they're saying, isn't that logically possible? Maybe, but that's not enough to give you probability. As I see reality, any situation in which, justice, I think there are moral facts. Justice wouldn't allow a situation in which theists get punished with hell and atheists get punished with eternity by a supernatural being. I don't see that as being metaphysically possible. And you can disagree with me on that, but it doesn't strike me as metaphysically possible. That would be a violation of basic fairness. It would involve a kind of deception, and a perfect being wouldn't deceive. So that's one way. A second way is realize when we assign probabilities, we don't assign them exhaustively. Take the most basic case, tossing a coin, you say 50-50, heads, tails. Believe it or not, mathematicians have shown, we're not talking the ideal case, but everyday cases, heads and tails are not exhaustive of the outcomes. Coins occasionally land on their edge. And you can look up YouTube videos of where at sporting events where they toss the coin and it's landed on its edge. There are actually YouTube videos where this happens. It's usually European soccer games they toss it. It's on its edge, And mathematicians, believe it or not, they've actually done a study. They show about 1 in every 6,000 tosses, not an ideal coin, but a coin thought fair enough, lands on its edge. But of course, we don't say heads, tails, and edge. You know, we just say heads and tails. Why? The probabilities are so small, we don't even take them into account. We neglect them. Again, going back to William James. James said some hypotheses, some alternatives are live, some are dead. That's a great metaphor, but how do we understand it? I think what James meant was, given our beliefs and given our beliefs, given our values, some alternatives appeal to us, some don't. Those that appeal to us are live hypotheses, those don't are dead hypotheses. And again, a Pascalian can borrow, perhaps anachronistically, but can borrow from James and say, look, the perverse master of the universe, it's a dead hypothesis. It warrants no probability. Perhaps it's possible, but it's so unlikely that there's no point assigning a probability to it. And so again, another way of trying to narrow a particular. Yeah.
I'd like to raise a new objection, but I don't want to interrupt the flow of your presentation.
No, in fact, let's call, I don't know where I am on time. Yeah, sorry. I'm way past time, probably. I'm starting to see yawns. But, so we're question answer. So, okay?
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, so Pascal's wager advocates that you should, well, ideally you want to come to believe in God for practical reasons, but you can't just flip the switch and believe in God. So, as we talked about earlier, you take a habit of doing as religious people do so as you come to believe in God. Presumably, because there's a non-zero probability associated with a religious lifestyle, that by having a religious lifestyle, you'll gain belief.
So you're gonna come up with a mini religions objection,
Well,
right?
actually-
So which religion do I follow? Who do I imitate?
You follow the bartenders. Over a glass of beer with friends, you can probably have a conversation that changes your life and makes you come to believe in God. So why not take a habit of drinking like every single day?
Yeah. So any action might have some small probability of resulting in belief in God, right? And so you can either drink from the communal cup or from the park. Either of them are going to result in the same possible outcome. Yeah, except presumably at the point, so this decision comes after the decision that one ought to inculcate. You know, suppose you agree with Pascal, you hold the field. Now I don't want to come to believe. There, I think practical probabilities are going to become very sensitive at that point, right?
How do we know that?
And but there the outcome is not infinite value, but directly it's what I'm concerned about is whether or not I'll come to believe by this action. And so there you kind of bracket or ignore the infinite utility that might result further down the road as well. You just want to come to believe.
Yeah.
So the probability, I think, there becomes very sensitive. So what's more likely? By imitating the faithful or imitating folks that might, for some weird reason, result in me becoming faithful?
How do we know? How do we know that the faithful do believe?
So how do we know the faithful do believe? I mean, this is like the other mind's problem. How do you know it's really? Well, I think the Pascalian's going to have to appeal at that point to say, look, it's just, you may be right. There are various incompatible faith communities. And so Pascal said, so in effect, you can think of the wager like this. Remember the game you played as kids? You can reach into the grab bag. So Pascal's saying, we've got one bag of theism, and there are various bags in here. The other bag of, say, naturalism. And what the wager's saying is, reach into this one. Now the wager, Pascal's gonna say, you're expecting too much for me to tell you, reach in, reach down this far, and over this way, and grab this particular one. That's too much. I'm just telling you, don't reach into that one. Reach into this one, and pull out, and follow. And someone can say, well, I want more. I want to know. You're expecting too much from one argument. That's too much advice from one argument.
Does that make sense?
So,
Wait, there's a question.
It's kind of a multi-part question, but I'll just start with the first one. Or I guess I'll just try to make it a two-part question. So, I don't see it here, but you were mentioning how we would partition from, Christian arguments for or the Christian God or the Jewish God, about any of that. So, what I would be curious about is how are we defining God in this context, and how does that necessarily lead to this breakdown grid in terms of that the God that we're talking about is one that would reward belief and that would not reward.
Yeah, so that's objection 4 at the bottom of the handout. And the quick response, and I'm not sure this is what Pascal would say, but from a decision theoretic point of view, I mean, maybe it turns out God's all forgiving. And so basically this is what in theology is called universalism. Maybe everybody's saved. Maybe, but but if that's the case, you can kind of ignore that one.
Right.
And so from a decision theoretic point of view, you're more concerned with cases where there's gain and loss associated with, in that one, everybody wins.
Right.
So set that aside, because if that turns out to be true, you're gonna win anyway.
Well, because it feels like part of this is that the primary, I mean, obviously this has to do with belief, with choosing to believe or not believe.
Yeah.
But it almost feels like there's the assumption made inherent in this argument that God rewards belief versus action.
Oh, okay.
So, because it also seems like, even in the case where you believe but God does not exist, well, you lived a moral life. Well, there's the assumption that believing leads to a more moral life.
Pascal's making that assumption, that's right.
Right. So, but if you have a case, if we're defining God as someone if we're defining God in that way, it almost starts to break down the partitions in some way, where you're starting to move into you could argue that there's some aspects of a Christian God that is being argued for specifically in this case, where if we're trying to make the partitions, where are we actually drawing those lines?
Yeah, I'm not sure, again, I'm not sure it's necessarily a Christian God, but theistic. So you want to keep your partition broader than, because if it is specific to Christianity, then you're going to have a problem, because you can do a wager for Judaism,
Right.
a wager for Islam, and so on.
Exactly.
So you want to so partition needs to be understood, for theism as opposed to Christian theism, Jewish theism, or Islamic theism. Does the wager presuppose that all you need, is a dead faith? Right? Is that what you're asking me? That all you need is one certain belief and that's it? I don't think that's, when you look, I told you that fourth version, when you look at Pascal's list, I think he believes that a certain attitude, a certain belief leads to a deep commitment, a way of life. And I think that way of life issues in certain actions and behaviors and conduct and good works and so on. Now the interesting, theologically, again, this is a rabbit I shouldn't even bring up, but he's a Jansenist, Calvinist basically, Catholic Calvinist. I thought those folks were people who believed God chose and not humans to
Right.
elect him. Yeah, okay, well, let's set that one aside. Good questions, other questions?
This is just a general reaction. It's hard for me to take it. It seems like there's a wink going on. It seems like a magic show. It seems like nothing up my sleeves. Now we've got the God, but something that I have no words for makes me feel like that's no way to be doing this.
Yeah, and so you're saying somehow it debases religion to.
It's cute. It's like I don't know Pascal, but it seems like if it just appeared occasionally or once, it could easily be like a statistician's plaything.
Yeah, and there is some aspect to that, and there is a common objection to the wager that says G. Moore was quoted as saying it's positively wicked. Whoa, it's wicked.
It seems irreligious.
Irreligious. In some sense, maybe. But I think what Pascal would say is, it doesn't matter where you start, it matters where you end up. And so it may be true, we're using the language of the gambling house to try to get you
It's like
at a
using
certain
prostitutes
location.
to get you into church.
Maybe not quite that. Maybe not quite that, but
That sounds religious.
maybe.
Prostitutes, anyway.
Prostitutes, yeah. I'm not sure the wager counts quite as a prostitute. But, and I don't think, it's certainly not prostituting your reason. I mean, this is a reasonable, an argument based on reason.
That's
right?
what seems irreligious.
That's based on reason, the argument.
Yeah.
But then that would be true for the cosmological argument, the ontological argument, the design argument, any argument.
I could be resistant.
You're a fideist. And so it's certainly true. It's certainly true that Pascal's going to say the fideist. It doesn't matter where you start, it matters where you end up. And that's what I'm concerned about. And presumably a morally perfect being is not going to say, well, you started bad, you ended up good. And I'm counting,
Prostitutes bracket.
yeah. So it may be true that where you start is questionable with the wager. I'm not sure it's true, but it may be true.
Well, drinking
But where
is
you end up-
okay, prostitutes are bad.
Depends what you're doing.
Thanks.
Yeah. Or else.
Actually, I was wondering, you mentioned that there seems to be a relation between belief and action from Pascal's perspective. But, it seems to me he assumes you need to have a certain type of beliefs to conduct your life in a certain way that leads to salvation. So it seems to me if we think of the minimum level of moral life, conducting a decent, moral, ethical life, in that case, you don't have to believe in God to have that kind of life. And that could lead to a salvation if, So in that case, I'm not quite sure about, that eternal damnation or, eternal salvation, which is restricted only to the believers. As long as, someone like John Hick says, belief actually is not that important. The way you conduct your life actually leads to salvation.
Yeah, maybe. This goes back to the whole theological debate, whether you can work your way into salvation, earn salvation or not. And of course, the wager looks like, at least on the surface, it's saying, well, look, if you work such that you gain belief, you've earned salvation. And I don't think you have to understand it that way. Which, what you're saying is, given that, then why can't we work other ways to earn salvation? So I don't think the wager, again, Pascal, and I haven't really thought much about the theology of it, to be honest with you. But Pascal wasn't, and again, I'm not a religious historian or historian of religion or theologian, but the way I understand Jansenism, it's basically Catholic Calvinism, which predestination, that God chooses who's saved and so on. So there's no way you work your way into salvation. So I assume with the wager, Pascal is consistent. So it may look like there's that in the wager, and insofar as the presentation this morning made it look that way, that maybe it's more artifact of my presentation rather than what's in the wager itself. So I don't think Pascal is saying you earn salvation by believing. I think he's saying you put yourself in a better position, that if you actually acquire salvation, it's maybe not so much in the final analysis the results of your actions, but recipient of grace or something. Maybe understand it that way. And then the whole question, well, what do you do about folks who lived exemplary lives and so on, who in fact didn't have the, a theistic belief state and so on? Well, that's not part of the wager, so I'm going to evade that question. That's a huge question, Yeah.
I think we're out of time, but so let's thank you.